Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, the companion podcast of the Tonearm.com. Here we talk with musicians, writers, and innovators about the ideas shaping media, art, and culture. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today the spotlight shines on Chris O'Leary. Chris has spent well over a decade and a half writing what's become the definitive study of David Bowie's songbook. His blog, Pushing Ahead of the Dame, covers every song on every album in Bowie's extensive canon. The first post from 2009 covers David's first single, 1964's Liza Jane, and the most recent post is about his latest work, a newly revised edition of Rebel Rebel, a collection of Chris's own writings on Bowie's work from 1963 to 1976. Chris has written for Pitchfork, Slate, and Billboard, and he's currently working on an online project called 64 Quartets, a series exploring musical quartets across genre. I previously booked Chris back in 2021 to speak at the Bowie 75 pop-up I produced in New York City. There he presented on Bowie and Brian Eno's 1995 album Outside. You can find that presentation on the official David Bowie YouTube channel with a link in our show notes. Chris is here to discuss his updated book, what new archival releases have taught us about David's creative process, and why he chose the blog format to tackle one of music's most ambitious written projects. And now, Chris O'Leary. So on this occasion of the new updated edition of Rebel Rebel, something that I've been wanting to ask you about is, of all the revelations and all the updating that you had to integrate over from the last decade, were there any items that came across to you as particularly interesting or surprising, sort of exciting in that batch of discoveries and revelations?
There were a few things. One is my misperception about how much storyline, quote unquote, Bowie had done for Ziggy Stardust. I thought that he had kind of made up the story about Ziggy after he made the album, kind of. And when he's talking to William S. Burroughs in late 1973, and he's talking about black hole jumpers and Ziggy being an extraterrestrial messiah figure, it all kind of felt like the stuff that he had come up with, after he had made most of the songs. And now with all the release of the demos and particularly the notebooks in the box sets, Rock and Roll Star and Divine Symmetry, you really can see that, no, he spent a lot of time thinking up the book of the play that was never made, the narrative. He really did have this kind of structure in mind. And it kind of changed the album for me. I could see how Velvet Goldmine, for example, fit in much better with the storyline now, because there was supposed to be a character called Zip, who was Ziggy Stardust's manager, and the manager would be singing Velvet Goldmine to him. It's like, obviously you can have your own interpretation of the song any way you want, but it's interesting. I found it really interesting to be like, oh, okay, this was intended as a stage role for this part that was then cut. And maybe that's one reason why he cut the song from the album, because it's a great song. I think many fans would argue it probably deserved to be on there more than something like It Ain't Easy, hit the Ron Davies cover that was actually recorded in Hunky Dory.
Yeah.
So it was the notebooks and the rough notes and the outtakes really did transform what I had thought about a few of the albums.
Something that your writing has really done for me as a fan and interested party in David's career is sort of how you've helped build narrative around and shed light on the sort of what I call the Proto Bowie.
Yeah.
And those years of woodshedding, I guess, and trying on different and persona and styles and just the ambition and the seeking that is wrapped up in all that. So in addition to the Ziggy sort of reframing or recontextualization, which is fascinating, I think that is a wonderful piece of insight. What did the flood of memoir and auctions and everything else that you've had to witness and metabolize over the last decade, what did they tell you about the Proto Bowie that was new? And what other eras did you get really new understanding of?
Yes, so the Again, the releases of the demos that were collected on a set conversation piece shed light on an area which was always kind of shadowy, which was the period after his first album, when he pretty much got dropped by his label, by Decca, before he wrote Space Oddity and before he got his contract with Philips Mercury. There's sort of a blank spot. It's basically 1968. And everyone knew, his manager said in his memoir, that Bowie was planning to do a second album in 1968. And there were a number of songs which everybody had assumed would be recorded for it, like When I'm Five and London by Tata, things like that. But what the demo showed is that, he kind of maybe what that album would have sounded like. Things like Goodbye Threepenny Joe. And even more intriguingly, there's a song called Jerusalem, which is kind of a little bit later, which is sort of after he writes Space Oddity, but it's before he records the album, which is a real coming head to head with the influence of Bob Dylan, which was kind of new. Because you could hear Dylan in it, obviously there's a song for Bob Dylan, but you also can hear Dylan in songs like Cygnet Committee and Unwashed and Somewhat Slightly Dazed. But this is pretty much a head-on, like, I am doing a Bob Dylan song.
Yeah. And
not just a Bob Dylan song, but a song specifically from the kind of bringing it all back home acoustic side. Those kind of Gates of Eden and It's All Right, Ma. These very, very long, endless stanzas of lyrics is what he's taking on in that. So I thought what it did was showed a little more about the development between the guy who did The Laughing Gnome in the first album and the guy who did Space Oddity, and that he did start out writing in the Durham style with these kind of slightly twee songs, and then you can see him and the influence of Lindsay Kemp, the mime, and that whole milieu that Kemp was part of. You can see it seeping in and changing the songs. Songs are getting a little more sophisticated, a little darker, even though the first album had plenty of dark songs in its way. But that was, I thought, very valuable, because that's kind of one of the big periods that nobody really knew much about apart from song titles.
The Cygnet Committee is a track for me that I think we're probably of similar age range. I think a lot about, especially with what I'll call the classic rock artists. Everybody has their version, right? And I came into David very similarly, I think, as you, basically the Let's Dance era. Maybe slightly earlier, I remember being aware of early MTV and seeing the videos for the albums around Scary Monsters. I remember being terrified of the Ashes to Ashes video when I was
it's like it's designed to terrify children. It's absolutely
it really
perfect
is
for that.
But so as I was exposed, like so many of our generation, to the sort of pop David in the 80s, and then very quickly got into crate digging and buying records on my own. Space Oddity, was one that was always in the used bins, and so one of the early acquisitions. And as a young teenager, Cygnet Committee was just a track that it befuddled me. And really, here we are over 40 years later, and it's one of those tracks that every time I hear it, it unlocks for me something that's very hard to articulate in the way that music can function as a time machine.
Yeah.
It's such an evocative song. It's so friggin' wordy.
It is. Yeah. It's again, you can kind of hear where the Dylan comes in. And it has a Dylan-like quality in that Dylan wrote a song, When the Ship Comes In, kind of one of these great civil rights movement songs. But the origin, allegedly, according to Joan Baez, was him being really angry at a hotel clerk who was rude to him. And I feel like Cygnet Committee it's him complaining about an arts lab in Beckenham, and that people in the arts lab are getting on his nerves. These kind of hippies who just are boring the hell out of him. And it's in a way, such a very, very minor gripe, given what's happening in the world in the 60s. But he uses that kernel of irritation to kind of just blow into this absolutely vista of fervor and anger and sort of disgust at everything, the world in general, over the course of 10 minutes. And it's very much a young person's song. It's an angry young man song, but it's also very strange. It's one of the first really compositions that you're like, only Bowie could have written this. This is a very unique and a very odd song that has multiple parts to it. And it, if someone sat down and tried to cover it, tried to learn the whole thing, I imagine it'd be challenging. It's hard to sing and probably hard to play. I think it's, the time signatures and the key changes and what have you.
Yeah. And to mimic that, the conviction sort of in the delivery is
yes. Yes.
How would you characterize his sort of 1963 to 1968? The ungenerous version is that he was trying to find the trend that he could latch onto. I mean, it's hard to reconcile that with, just studying mime.
Yes.
I'm not sure.
Yes.
I'm not sure that was a path to mainstream success.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it stems from Bowie created his own myths and he created his own story of himself. And so he was one of the first people to be like, it starts with Space Oddity. Everything before that was juvenilia and was just, don't pay attention to it. He was kind of embarrassed by it. It also helped that it wasn't owned by the same record companies. So whenever you did a reissue or a greatest hits, there wasn't the access to the songs. So basically, you always start with Space Oddity. You always start with that period. So I think you can divide it into like three parts. One is I think, quite real, desperate attempt to become a pop star by any means possible. Sort of Yardbird stuff, and then he moves into softer pop, and then he tries to do Spencer Davis Group, kind of white soul, and then he goes right into sort of early psychedelia. So he is but he's never like embarrassingly behind the trend. He was always very good at being very, very keen at seeing where things were going and being right there. So there's never a time where you're like, wow, he's trying this kind of old hat. Like, a great example is that he's covering the Velvet Underground before the album was out in America, because his manager gets him an acetate at the end of 1966. So he was always kind of very in vogue. But I think there's a real break, as you said, with Kemp, with his consecutive failures. I think by the time of the first album, it doesn't really go anywhere. And Laughing Gnome kind of feels like one last go for the brass ring. Like, I'm going to do a big, silly song and maybe it'll be a hit. After that, he kind of is like, okay, that path is not going to work for me. So what can I do? And I think there is a period where he is considering becoming more of a theatrical artist, or becoming, Anthony Newley was always an influence, but the idea of becoming somebody who could write songs for others to sing while he was an actor, while he was a playwright or film director. One of Bowie's big unrealized dreams was to be a film director. And so that, and the mime stuff, and also the influence of people like Lionel Bart, who he knew, and he was in that social circle, does change the trajectory, which otherwise, I think at one point, he was like an eccentric Steve Marriott until then. And then, by the time of, Space Oddity and Cygnet Committee, he's on his own course. He's kind of gone in a path that no one else, even Mark Bolan. Mark Bolan kind of had the mod to hippie transition, but it's a pretty simple one. It's a pretty straightforward one, where Bowie takes a long time to get there.
Before we move on from this era, I know this involves a little bit of time shifting, but I can't help but be fascinated with the whole endeavor around Toy. Really, the last, I don't know, let's pick a number and call it 20 years, maybe 25 years of David's life, where for an artist who was so adamant about always looking forward, became much more bring the themes and riffs and ideas into his contemporary music, and then peaking with him going back and re-recording all those songs, or recording the songs from this early Proto Bowie era. How does that land for you? Like, what do you get from that?
Yeah, it's kind of a strange period, even though it's a mainstream quote unquote period.
Yeah.
But, as you said, he spent the 90s really fighting tooth and nail to not become a legacy act, to not become Elton John or something. And somebody who could just, play sheds and play summer tours and sing changes and sing rebel to people, and everybody would be happy, and you go home. And he put out an album, and you do like, here's a song for the new album, and everybody's like, oh yeah, polite applause, and then waits for the next hit. That's sort of what the trajectory is for people who were big in the 60s and early 70s. And he's really fighting desperately to not have that be his fate yet. And then at the end of the 90s, there's almost like a relaxation, like a falling back of like, okay, I am in my 50s now, and people do love the old music, and I don't mind playing it anymore. And so there's kind of where he returns to Glastonbury and this kind of Return of the King kind of style in 2000.
Yeah.
And he does, all these old hits for the BBC and for some select shows in New York for his website. And so Toy, I think, is part of that. I think Toy is like a let the gates open, let the waters come in again. It's okay. But also I think there is because as I said, he was always so loath to acknowledge any of this music from the 60s. And it was kind of like an acceptance of like, this is part of me also. This is the canon. I can't help thinking about me, and I dig everything. And those songs, they're as much a part of me as Sheen Genie is. So I think that was part of it. But also, in a more mercenary angle, I think he had a composition partner for many years now with Reeves Gabrels. Gabrels co-wrote Hours with him, co-wrote most of Earthling. Outside was collaborations with Eno, with Alomar and Gabrels and Mike Garson in the kind of group sessions. So Bowie, for some time, had rarely kind of just sat down and written stuff again. And I think he was a little out of shape, isn't it? Maybe not the right way to say it, but kind of not used to having to go back down to the keyboard and put everything together by himself. And so I think doing covers was a way to kind of maybe buy a little time until he could get back in the groove. And you can kind of hear it towards the end when he starts writing the songs that turn up on Heathen, like Afraid and what became Slip Away, the great song, Uncle Floyd. That comes towards the end, and you can kind of be like, okay, he's back. But I think Toy was a convenient way to like get in the studio, make a new album. I've already written these songs, and they've already been arranged, so let's just play. Because the arrangements of Toy are not radically different from the originals. They're played probably better, more professionally, and recorded in modern style, but it's not like they're doing wild improvisations or changes to these songs.
Yeah. Well, and his band is so good at that point too.
Exactly,
that band was
yeah.
so hot.
Yeah, so they're kind of treating it like just like other Bowie compositions. They nailed the performance down, they get it done in a few takes, and so I think it was probably a fairly easy album to make. And plus, he was about to become a father again, so I think that was also part of it.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I promise we'll go back in a moment, but I'm very excited about this forthcoming Eras box for September because, I talk a lot with people, Bowie fans, people, just lots of Bowie interested people. We all seem to share this phenomenon, which is when Bowie's records came out in real time, I'll just speak for myself. I often didn't get them or didn't like them or shrugged or found the 2 or 3 songs and then moved on. Almost to an album, I could go back with, say, a decade's worth of hindsight, sometimes more, sometimes less, be completely floored at the quality of the albums. I've had that experience with the what I'd call the Sony era with the 2000s albums. I was pretty immersed in the world of Bowie when Heathen came out, and I liked it, and I was excited to have a high-profile new album. It didn't, it wasn't on heavy rotation for me, and then very excited when Reality came out, and it was the same thing. Like there were a couple of tracks I like. I go back to both those albums now and then forward to the next day, and I'm like, wow, like this. I would almost say that one of my favorite Bowie characters was the adult male, middle-aged man who was committed to being an artist, like a working songwriter. I admire what he was doing.
Yeah. It's interesting because like there, as you said, there's a great example of albums that I think were pretty well reviewed at the time. And classic, like Rolling Stone 4 stars kind of treatment.
Yeah.
But I don't think they made a huge impact. I think it's always different in the UK. I think they sold more and maybe you heard them on the radio once in a while. But I feel like in the US, they just really were not. This was the period of like the Strokes and Missy Elliott and Eminem and all of that. And so he's not really there in my memories of the early 2000s. And so there's the contemporary albums, but they're a little bit out of time. And maybe, distance, as you said, does reveal more about them. I think, Heathen is definitely a capital P performance, sort of a real character thing, whereas Reality feels more like, as you said, a working older artist.
Yeah.
With like a few covers and some up-tempo songs for the tours, and then a few brooding numbers. And you can see him using that. I mean, the Next Day kind of has a similar template, though it's different in some ways. But you can kind of see him using Reality as kind of the guidebook to, if he had made some more albums in the 2000s, if he had had a 2006 album or 2009 album, I don't think it would have sounded radically different from Reality.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it would be actually very interesting to have heard the album that bridged him from Reality to the Next Day. Yeah, maybe that's in the vault somewhere. Who knows?
Yeah.
I'm curious about that flood of memoir that you refer to.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any ones in particular that, the rock, we all know that rock and pop culture memoirs can be very self-serving and, they're fraught with peril as you navigate them.
Yeah.
Was there one or two that you were that really stuck out for you where you said, this is actually additive. This is not just self-mythologizing?
Yeah. John Hutchinson. For those who don't know, John Hutchinson was Bowie's partner for a brief time in the Space Oddity period. They were kind of like a Simon and Garfunkel duo. And then Hutchinson returned, I think he was getting no money, so he had a small child and was married, so I had to go back to work. And then a few years, during the 1973 Ziggy Stardust tour, Hutchinson joined the band again and was kind of the rhythm guitarist. And his memoir he died 2018, I'm drawing a blank. It was after Bowie died. And the memoir came out in 2014 or 2015. And it's really interesting because, he's a entertaining writer, but also it is just being in this, one of these people who just is in history's way. Like he is right there when David Bowie becomes David Bowie for the first time.
Yeah.
And you can see it changing as in months when he goes from being the guy that Hutchinson first knew, who was like this kind of struggling pop singer in mid-60s London, to this kind of much different person. It ends with him as, on stage at the Hammersmith Odeon at the last Ziggy concert, and what a transformation that is for him. But in Hutchinson's perspective, is always very grounded and pretty humorous and sees the absurdity of it, but also is kind of like aware of how privileged a view he has. That adds to it. And then the other one from the same period I thought was really fascinating was Mary Finnegan. Mary Finnegan was the person who co-founded the Arts Lab in Beckenham with Bowie. And she was Bowie's roommate and girlfriend very briefly in 1969. Just the view that she has of Bowie, you could kind of see what people have said about him over the years, and that he had different doors to him. So that, if you were a musician on his touring group, you'd see one side of him. Obviously other people would see different sides of him. And so she gets this very charming, extremely charismatic artist who kind of moves in and spends all his time writing songs. And at the same time as this is happening, he's like, his manager is working the phones and he's recording Space Oddity. He's still doing pop music. And she is not even aware of that. To him, he is this kind of countercultural figure who suggests, let's do this folk club. Let's have this kind of neighborhood theatrical troupe. There's one kind of wonderful, it's the kind of thing you wish was filmed or recorded in some way. I think it was like I don't know if it was a recreation of Lord of the Rings or reading from the Lord of the Rings, but Bowie was part of this thing where they would like go on the town green and maybe act out scenes from, the Two Towers or something, which is just absolutely bizarre and charming to imagine.
In English.
In English. And also, he's into UFO spotting, and he's into obviously some of the other things but again, it's like somebody who catches him at a very, very limited period of time, but you can kind of see everything happening in the background. So those are the two that, in terms of like, things I'd recommend as books, those are up there.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On and Chris O'Leary right after this break.
After listening to this episode, head to thetonearm.com, our online journal covering unexpected music and culture. This week on The Tonearm, Matt Piucci of the Los Angeles band Rain Parade recalls the heyday of the Paisley underground scene. Lebanese band Sanam discusses the existential threats that inhabit the intensity of their experimental rock recordings. Composer Lila Moretsky reveals how her album's simultaneous contrast applies theories of color to music. And music and sound artist M. Sage reports from a farm in rural Colorado, the inspiration behind his new album, Tender Waiting. You'll find all this and more on The Tonearm. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to our email newsletter. That's thetonearm.com. The Tonearm, putting a needle on the cultural wax.
And now, back to Spotlight On. Something that maybe doesn't get mentioned enough in the context of your work, and I'm going to write that wrong, Chris, is, first of all, I really struggle to think about pushing ahead of the Dame as a blog. It seems such a small word for such an ambitious and rigorous undertaking, but I don't need to get hung up on the semantics on your behalf if you're okay with it.
Yeah, it's fine with me.
But, there's a rigor and a precision to what you do that could be said to to have more in common with books. Or I actually have come to really think of what you do as, in a way, a predecessor to what Andrew Hickey's doing with the 500 Songs podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I mean that in the way of using one of these new media to explore, long form narrative in a serial fashion of nonfiction subjects. Doing these sort of academic works in these new media. I'm curious about, how you arrived at, I'm even going to struggle to articulate, and I have to apologize, but choosing to elevate the blog as a medium, I guess would be the way I'd say it, because you could have done much less. Did you not have path to publishing at that point? Did you just want the work out in real time? Like, could you just give me maybe a little bit of, if not necessarily the Genesis origin story, more like what you were thinking, like, yeah. Hopefully I'm getting at it.
Oh, yeah. I think the important thing is that I did not set out to do anything that of the scope that it became. I think if that had been the plan from the beginning, it probably would have failed. I think it only survived and it only grew because my expectations of it were so minor. I had started doing, now this will date me, it was called MP3 blogging in 2004. I had thought about writing about music for some time, but I never, I wasn't really connecting with what was popular in the end of the 90s, early 2000s. So I didn't really have anything to say a lot about a lot of the music that was out. And also it seemed so daunting to try to break into whatever was out there then. But I thought I wanted to write about music in some way. And so there was suddenly this kind of vogue for do-it-yourself publishing based on the Blogger platform for the most part. And that's how it started. It was a blog called Locust Street. And the idea was to do a song for every year of the 20th century. And then I realized I didn't really know much about the 1900s or the 1910s. So I was like, I'm going to start with, I'll start it after the war, 1945, which I know a little more about. And then it kind of went on from there. And then I went back to the start of the century. That was most of the 2000s. And it was something that was not like a huge success by any means, but it had like a small little readership, and I liked doing it. It was a nice distraction. But I was kind of getting burned out. And so I thought, well, maybe to rejuvenate myself, I'll do another blog thing with the idea that, there'd be a side project and maybe I would abandon it at some point, but it would be nice not to have to think about recreating 1947 or whatever I was doing. And so I thought like, okay, well, I had gone through, I had a period where my personal life was kind of an upheaval. And so one of the things I did to kind of ground myself was I would have lunch with my dog. I had the book Revolution in the Head by Ian MacDonald, which is a song by song in chronological order thing of the Beatles. And so every day I would like get the MacDonald book and I would listen to the song while I had my sandwich, and I would read the entry. And I thought this is a kind of a fun way to listen to the Beatles, because I heard the Beatles ever since I was a child, because my parents loved them. But I mostly knew them through album sequencing. or what have you. But I kind of go through the songs in the order they were made and kind of think about each one over the course of 15 minutes, whatever. I thought it was really a perspective I hadn't had before. And I said, boy, did that be fun to do this in a blog format, with the idea of somebody would be at work, really kind of not wanting to go to work yet on a Monday morning. And then he'd be like, okay, well, what's the new song? And that would be the point of it. So like back when the blog started, it was going at a really fast clip. It was like three entries a week, which seems absolutely superhuman to me right now. But like, it was like almost a daily blog. And the whole point was that, here's a song, here's some stuff about it, and blah, blah. And it kind of went from there. And as a year went on, the tension was taken away from this other project I was doing, this long-term thing. And the Bowie thing took up more and more time because I got more ambitious with it. And I also kept reading more about it. But I never had the idea that it was ever going to be a book or anything. And then once it was picked up by a few people, it was picked up by Tom Ewing, who runs a blog called Popular. And then it weirdly got picked up by Time Magazine, of all people. Time Magazine wrote about it, and The Guardian and a few others. And so more and more people would come, and there was a good comment section developed. And then through that, Tariq Goddard, who was then at a publisher called Zero Books, contacted me and said, do you want to turn this into a book? And I was like, oh, yeah, okay. And that's how it started, and so it was always a bit of a haphazard and not really planned out thing. And so I do consider the books, particularly this second version of Rebel Rebel, the revised version, to be kind of my final word on stuff, even though I'm sure I'll disagree with myself at some point in the future. But whereas the blog, if you go back to the blog, you'll see it, in some cases it's more flippant or it's more sillier or what have you. And that was kind of the first go at it. And so you kind of have, if you really wanted to, you could have three different versions of three different moments in time as to what I thought of a song, like Cygnet Committee or what have you. Yeah, so if you really wanted to, you can compare the 2009 blog entry to the 2015 book entry to the 2025 book entry. And you might see I have grown up in some ways or grown down or, And
now I know what I'm doing this afternoon. Thanks, Chris.
But yeah, so I think if people like it, if I brought enjoyment to people, I do think it kind of came about in this kind of, to use, for lack of a better word, organic way. But I did not have a master plan summer of 2009 that this is going to be a 2-book series, blah, blah, blah. It was much, much more slipshod than that.
I think a lot of us have seen projects, whether they're our own or other people, who start with a flourish and a statement, right? Like, this blog is going to be this. Mm-hmm. And then after, a few weeks, it becomes, it's in the graveyard of abandoned projects.
It's hard. Yeah. It's hard. It's hard to keep it up. It's frustrating. Yeah. I totally get it.
Would you have ever let yourself stop? Like, or did you ever have a conversation with yourself where you were like, come hell or high water, I have to do this now? Or is part of your ability to keep doing it that you've always allowed the trapdoor?
Yeah, no, I'm trying to think if there was a moment I kind of hit a wall. I don't think so. There was a time I was doing the revisions for the first version of Rebel Rebel. And at the same time, I was doing new entries, which I think were on Earthling. So it was this really hard transition between revising the 60s stuff and then having to write new stuff on mid-90s material. And that was, I think I maybe put the blog on mini hiatus then because it was just too much. It was exhausting. And the other time was after Bowie died, I still had a few to go. I put out most of them. The rest are in the Ashes to Ashes book. There was probably like 5 or 6 songs left. And I just did not have the heart to do it anymore.
Yeah.
I just felt like everything had changed, and it felt like suddenly, a big curtain had dropped, and the blog had to become something different. It couldn't be what it was. But yeah, no, I think by the time I was really getting rolling, I felt like I'm too much of a completist, and also I can't be the guy who abandoned the Bowie song by song guide before he even hit like Ashes to Ashes. Yeah, I didn't want that on my gravestone, Had a good idea and it didn't work out. And so, so I kept with it by gum. Yes.
Almost. Yeah. I remember reading in real time when David passed and being a follower of the blog. And also the fact that it's easy to forget how wrapped up everybody was in the power of Black Star. And then
Oh,
all of a
yeah.
sudden we have it for 3 days and this other event has that completely recasts what the album apparently could have meant. The whole mythology of it being
Yeah.
the audio death mask, really incredible moment. And
Hmm.
it's also easy for people to forget how long it went on, right? Like it was one of the few celebrity passings that it felt like it took months for the intensity of the emotion to die down.
Yeah, and it was just a really strange, dispiriting year because you feel like when everybody had started coming to terms with Bowie, then Prince died. I believe Prince died in April.
Yeah.
And it felt like there was just a series of shocks that kept happening throughout the year. Leonard Cohen dying at the end of it, and George Michael. It just was almost like somebody was writing a tragedy that year, 2016.
Did Carrie Fisher die that year also?
Probably, yeah. I mean, it was just real, like the wheels really fell off.
And then we had a certain presidential election.
Yeah, and Brexit happened that summer. It was just everything kind of happened. It feels like a real hinge year.
Yeah. Wow. Could you tell me a little bit about how you listen? Like, and I kind of mean it from a process point of view, like I'm curious. I have this image of you like in a listening room with a chair and a pad and a quill and like thoughtfully stroking your chin as you're listening to each track. But there has to be some kind of visiting and revisiting and metabolizing, and I'm curious if you could peel back a little bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, I start out. So when I was doing it, I would kind of know the next album or the next period. Listen to it like on background while I was cooking or something to kind of get into it. And then when it came time to really dig into the song, I think I just put on headphones and I'd listen to it a couple times. I would, there was like sheet music, I would kind of use that as a basis and then kind of write in over that drum lines and bass lines and what have you. And then see if, kind of because I had this kind of big pile of research by that point. So kind of searching through like, what did Bowie say about this song in various interviews? What were reviewers at the time? What did they say about it? So kind of getting all of that in, and then just kind of sometimes, listening to it 4 or 5 times in a row to kind of train myself to be like, this time I'm going to listen to the bass. Or this time I'm going to listen to what the backing singers are doing to try to really, really kind of get into, because the thing I really wanted to do from an early point in that was to make it as much a musical, a study of the music as much as the lyrics. Because I think, understandably, when people write about music, it's often about the lyrics. It's the easiest thing to write about. If you're a writer, what is the person singing? What do the lines mean? What's the rhymes? What's the imagery? And that's very important. But I think I really want to not downplay that, this is recorded music and this is people in a studio playing this way, and it's being mixed in a certain way, and there's choices being made to turn this up, turn this down, and to arrange things in a certain way, and kind of how all that comes together to make the final song. It would be like maybe a day or two of this kind of really tedious, back again, first minute, second minute again, just what am I hearing? And then the writing, it would depend. This is, again, it was faster back in my youth. You could do it in a couple of days. And at some point it became, this took a week or 2 weeks or something. But it was never an extremely long time. And it was never any kind of, unfortunately, I didn't have a cork-lined or soundproof room with Quadrophonic speakers or anything. It was mostly Discman and headphones at one point before then the iPod and my living room speakers. That's pretty much it.
It's interesting because, you articulate a similar evolution as what I perceive happening again with the Andrew Hickey podcast, right? He started off being able to very quickly produce shorter episodes, and then all of a sudden something happened and he was sucked in, and now we get these 2, 3, 4, 5-hour epic explorations.
Oh yeah, it's incredible. That's wonderful. I do love that you can see that there's a certain element of his fan base who are, what's going on here? And I think it's marvelous, and that he's it's becoming like a history of the 20th century
It really
at
is.
this point. And it's just fascinating that, the tangents he goes on and what he brings in. I think it's just really incredible work. And I believe, not to speak for him, but I believe he said that as we get out of this kind of crux period of the late 60s, early 70s, things might start compressing a little bit. I don't know if there's that much to write about if he does like Staying Alive or something. I'm sure there's plenty to talk about, but like you're kind of, the culture, rock music is maybe not as directly embedded with the events of the day in 1978 as it was in 1968. So maybe there'll be a slight,
Yeah.
the lens might tighten a little bit, but right now I'm really just enjoying the hell out of it. I can see that, somebody who just wants something to listen to on the drive to work is, it's just like, maybe, a little baffled but they're missing out. And I really hope people stick with that podcast. It's a treasure.
I love playing the parlor games with some of my music loving friends about like trying to guess what he's going to do in the 80s and 90s. Yeah, it's I remember, I don't know, a year or two ago, maybe more now, there was a profile in the New Yorker about him, and one of the anecdotes was that by the time he's done, it's going to be one of the largest, if not the largest work by a single individual or something like that in the English language. Or it's
oh yeah, I can believe that. Yeah,
it's insane. It's absolutely insane. What lineage do you see yourself in terms of, you work at sort of this nexus of academic study and fan devotion and being rigorous, yet having this accessible voice, which seems to be such a big part of your success and your ability for your work to connect with the audience. Do you see yourself as part of a team or a league or a lineage?
Not really. Obviously, there are music writers who I loved when I was first reading rock criticism. I mean, Grail Marcus and people like that, and John Savage, Charles Shaar Murray. And, there are writers whose work I always will read when I see something by them, by Nate Patron and Michelangelo Matos and Amanda Petrusic and people like that. I don't really consider myself a rock critic or anything. What I do is kind of odd, and I never was part of that world. I felt, nor do I remotely think I'm like an academic. I was I got a bachelor's degree in journalism. That's as far as it went. So I don't know what I do really. I don't think I'm aligned with anybody. I mean, I feel in Hickey's podcast as sort of a simpatico soul. I've like, well, I understand where he's going. And but I don't consider myself part of a team, as you said. I think what I did, I don't know if it could be done today. I do wonder about, I fear there's sort of this really societal push to downplay writing at this point, to make this sort of a more visual society with sort of AI replacing what people, human beings once wrote. And I don't think that's a great thing in terms of, for example, when you go back, you're writing about Bowie in the 70s, you can expect that there's, if he went on tour or he put an album out, that there's going to be dozens of pretty well-written reviews of his concerts and reviews of his records and in-depth interviews with him, whether it's radio people or magazine writers or newspaper writers or fan writers.
Yeah.
There's this kind of great corpus of material to use. And now I wonder, like, I guess Taylor Swift is not a good example, because I sort of feel like there's just tons of writing about Taylor Swift. But I'm thinking of like maybe a second tier person, because I don't know if that infrastructure is there anymore. And so if this is the year 2050 and you want to write about, I don't know, Bruno Mars or something, I mean, what's there going to be? Like, is the stuff going to survive? Or the YouTubes and TikToks and podcasts, is the technology going to be there in 30 years for the stuff to even get played? And will anything be archiving it? Will AI mash it all up and it becomes this kind of Wikipedia voice crap that's all over the internet? And so you don't even, I do just hope that there's kind of a pushback against that because I think it is a loss. And I think that the stuff that I was able to do with somebody like David Bowie, I don't know if somebody's going to be able to do simply because the research, the reference material is just not going to be as dense, is not going to be as rich.
Yeah, and it's such an era of publicists and control as
Yes,
well
yeah.
that you won't get some of the philosophizing that David would do.
Yeah, you think of like, all the interviews, all the great interviews with him where he's just going off. And Pete Townsend is another great example. Neil Young, these, they would just kind of say sometimes crazy things, but like absolutely no filter. And it just feels like if there's nobody, who's kind of famous right now, who's doing anything like that, because they're scared witless probably, and rightfully so. But if they said one thing that somebody could take out of context in any way, they're going to get lambasted for it. Or, the president will call them out in a tweet or something insane. So like, I understand the wariness and the sort of the corporate boiler speak stuff that everything seems to be written in right now.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because I try to I definitely hear you and relate to what you're saying. I try to be careful to not let that for myself bleed into becoming a cranky old man or.
Oh yeah, very much, yes. And I do think that podcasting, there's a great future in that. And I do hope that if the video is the future, that there is going to be people who are really adept in video and can make video more of an archival and a more, rich medium. I fear in the latter case, just from like, he tried to play a CD-ROM from the late 90s lately. I do wonder if that stuff is even going to be technically able to be accessed.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so many of the early, even David's website, so much of that stuff's gone.
Oh, yeah.
The little flash
There's
things
so
that
much,
were built.
yeah.
And yeah.
There's so much from the two. It's, someone had a good point that it's probably easier to find out something, a primary source from like the 30s than it is the 2000s at this point. Because at least all the newspapers are microfilmed somewhere.
Yeah. It's interesting you raised that example. I was talking to a friend of mine last night who's he's doing a revised version of a book he wrote.
Mm-hmm.
He has spent a bunch of time basically in archives like that, going through microfiche and just going down rabbit holes. And he said something very similar about how there's this rich body of material and especially when you get into music and cultural, for lack of a better way to say it, subcultures, right? Like all the great regional and local Black newspapers that existed. And there was this whole parallel universe of things going on that historians wouldn't know about if they only read, the mainstream newspaper in a city, things like that.
Yeah, all the alt weeklies, all the zines, that stuff is incredibly valuable. Yeah. And I do hope some version of that continues. I feel like it's more of a challenge now.
You had said that, it's hard to close the door on Bowie even now. Mm-hmm. Yet you've made a couple of comments around trying to tamp down the the engagement with the work. I wonder how you're thinking about, or if you're going to have to reckon with the inevitable further releases and discoveries, and it's highly unlikely that the body of work is done being revealed. Are you adopting I'll deal with it as it comes thing, or?
Yeah, I really regretted that. I really thought that the chapters on Space Oddity and Hunky Dory and Ziggy Stardust were much improved by the release of the archival stuff. And I really regretted that I couldn't wait until Diamond Dogs, if they do anything, because I feel like Diamond Dogs is a real challenge, I think, still to get a hold of, the grasp of how it all came together. I think it's one of the more shadowy processes for him, because he's doing so many different things in the kind of post-Ziggy months. He has so many different ideas, plays and films and albums and musicals and so forth. And so a little more light as to like, okay, how serious was the 1984 project? How serious was the Ziggy Stardust musical he was talking about? What songs come from what that we really know, and what was going on with the Astronauts, his vocal trio with Ava Cherry and Jeff McCormick, just at the same period. And could Mick Ronson and him have still worked together in some way? There's so many kind of unanswered questions. So yeah, if a lot of material came out from that period, I'd be tempted at some point to be like, yeah, I gotta get the back half of Rebel Rebel a little better, but that won't be for a very long time.
Touch wood.
And in terms of, I don't know, because the release strategy so far for these sets has been to show you some things, some demos and a few studio outtakes and the notebooks. But at the same time, it's not on the scale of like a Dylan bootleg series or with some of these Beatles super deluxe sets, which is just all the stuff, is tons of stuff. It feels very, very controlled. And so I don't know if we're ever going to get that kind of rigorous documentation of Bowie's songwriting. So I don't know, for example, if we're going to ever learn more about, as we've said, reality or Heathen. That could be like all we have is what we have there. But I guess I'll find out. I would, at this point, I don't see the need to really update the second book, and I'm at the moment curious to see what comes out, but in no rush to do anything else.
Is it unfair to ask you if there is anything from a song to an album to an era that you are repeatedly drawn back to, either because of your intellectual curiosity or just because of your passion as a fan?
Yeah, it's because we talked about, I started out as Let's Dance. That's how I first knew Bowie, and probably, terrified also of the Ashes to Ashes video. And then I didn't really follow him that much, and the Ryko disc reissues came out on CD in the early 90s. So that was kind of my first introduction to him. Man Who Sold the World was the first one I got. That's kind of a shock if you knew David Bowie as Let's Dance or Blue Jean, Dancing in the Streets. It sounds like a weird, a strange takeoff on Black Sabbath or something. It's like, what is this stuff?
Yeah.
So I've always had a soft spot for that album. It feels like it's a bit anomalous. It feels very much like what I think it was, which is that Mick Ronson and Tony Visconti had time in the studio to kind of do whatever they wanted, and Bowie kind of was distracted and would come in and say like, yeah, sounds great. I'm going to write this song. I'm going to write that song. So I've always loved that album because it was one of the first records for me, but also because it's such an outlier. It kind of is in the middle of the sequence, which it doesn't really fit. And then I think always the Low and Heroes period, because I think it's an act of it's one way that he was able to remain relevant in later in life, I think, because that was the time for people who had had success in the 60s and early 70s.
Yeah.
End of the 70s is when new wave kicks in, when there's disco. It's when a lot of these guys start floundering. You have, missteps or trend chasing or reactionary moves or what have you. And I do think that Berlin Records are this kind of wonderful sidestep that he does. I don't think intentionally. I think it was kind of where he was going anyhow, because he was trying to take what he learned from Man Who Fell to Earth, the soundtrack that he never finished. But it turns out that it really put him in a very good place, because it wasn't like he was ripping off punk or anything. The music was not really mainstream at this point, and that kind of kept him. He didn't become Rod Stewart. He didn't become, even like T-Rex the last years before Bolan died. You can see he was really, really trying and really, really trying to get back. And he had like a TV show where he had a few punk bands on, so he was getting there too. But Bowie, it feels more like it's this moment where he kind of, again, steps out of time a little bit and has these little discrete, little strange records. I always found that really interesting.
Yeah. I think that's a great take on that era and how it really did establish him as something other than, something other than the template of like, go be an arena rocker.
Yeah. And they were not, in America, they were pretty much duds. Jeff Rugvie, who was Ryko's guy, who did the Sound and Vision box set, said that, the last disc of that is Low Through Scary Monsters, and he wanted to subtitle it What America Got Wrong, What America Missed, because, the music was not played on the radio, and it didn't sell. Lodger, I think, was very much a big stiff commercially in America.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one reason maybe the records sound so fresh, is that they are played to death. They almost are like they sound more experimental than maybe they even are because they just were not part of the conversation in the late 70s. They weren't competing with Rumors or the Rolling Stones' Some Girls. It was like they were just
Yeah.
were in their own little, as I said, kind of a little aisle.
Yeah. It's really fascinating, too, that people don't really understand how, if you're an American and you grew up in the States, your experience with David Bowie is completely different than anywhere else on the planet.
Oh, very different.
Yeah, the
Very
scale of
different,
his
yeah.
success and the sustained duration of his even commercial or chart success outside of America is really hard to fathom.
Yeah, like a classic rock radio. David Bowie was like 6 songs. It was like Space Oddity, Changes, Ziggy Stardust, Gene Genie, Rebel Rebel, maybe Young Americans. That was it.
Yeah.
That's all you'd heard. And, like Drive-In Saturday was like a number 2 hit single in England, and no one knew what the hell that song was in America unless you're like a hardcore fan.
Thank you so much, Chris O'Leary. And as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On. If you're interested in more of our episodes touching on the life and work of David Bowie, check out last week's episode with Donnie McCaslin, or maybe 2022's episode with Chris Duffy, or even 2021's episode with David Whitehead. You can also visit spotlightonpodcast.com and type Bowie into the search box. Spotlight On is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson. Editing and sound design is by Terry Grant. Our theme music is by Q-Burn's Abstract Message. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Now, please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts. Then visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com and explore the free episode archive. For more interviews and writings from me and a diverse array of contributors, check out Tonearm.com. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.